Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. A visit to occupied Palestine is our topic for today. Cynthia Franklin, professor of English at UH Mānoa, is here as our guest, and she's the one who visited occupied Palestine recently. And thank you for coming to talk to us about this particular topic.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Before we start on the visit and so forth, would you tell us like how you became interested in occupied Palestine and something about your background, and then we can go to the visit itself.
Well, there are many different kind of factors that got me interested in Palestine. One is, the oldest is that I'm from a fairly non-practicing Jewish family, but an unthinkingly Zionist one. So I grew up with the idea that Israel was the homeland, and I never even heard the word Palestinian. I heard Arab, and it was always a kind of not so nice word. And I never really thought about it until actually I got to college, and I had a roommate, and I said something, and I don't remember what it was, but I do remember getting, kind of slammed by her. And it was just this really the first time I had thought about Palestine. And I think that's been an interest that's been developing since. And I think coming from a kind of unthinkingly Zionist family and community and culture has made me feel a particular interest and responsibility, I guess, in terms of how to kind of want to distinguish between being Jewish and being Zionist. And that was something that wasn't distinguished for me through most of my childhood, but I've increasingly come to think it's really important to distinguish between Zionism and Judaism. And so that's one thread. The other is that I co-edit the journal Biography and have a kind of interest in testimonial uses of life writing, and so Palestine has come up in that way for me as a site where people's stories are, where people have difficulty getting their stories out, and once they're out, having them have any impact. And so part of my interest has developed through my interest in life writing in relation to human rights. And then I also have been doing scholarship I've worked on Edward Said and his memoirs, and so that obviously, was a route into Palestinian issues for me, as was work on the Eichmann trial, which is what I'm working on right now, and thinking about that trial as a state-building project for Israel, and also a way the U.S. has been heavily involved in supporting Israel as a Jewish state.
Yeah, actually, each of the strains you mentioned, we can have like a whole program about it. But, we often hear about Zionism and then Zion because of the Bible and all that. And in fact, in some movies, you have like this thing about Zion, etc. So what is your understanding of Zionism? So because we mentioned it, what it is. We mentioned the term. So how do you think about that term, Zionism, when we say he or she is a Zionist? Or
the associations I carry with me now for Zionism have to do with making Israel a homeland for Jews. And that is a right and a claim that is biblically based. And I think my problem with Zionism comes with the fact that it seems to accompany an erasure of or a demonization of Palestinians and their claims to that space. And actually Christians' claims, as well. Jerusalem is a site that means a lot of things to people of different faiths. And I think that the kind of whole notion of a chosen people that is accompanied by special rights that involve displacing others and depriving others of their rights is what about Zionism that bothers me. And I have trouble understanding how you can have a Jewish democracy, which is, I think, the hope for Israel right now. And I think a lot of claims on the kind of soft Zionism are no, it's a democracy. We want, Arabs to have a place. But I don't see that happening, and I haven't seen that happening historically.
Yeah. Because there's a contradiction in terms between, Zionist democracy.
I would say
Jewish
that of
democracy.
any religious state.
Yes, absolutely.
Not, I would say it of absolutely any. I just think having a religiously founded state is going to be at odds with democracy, regardless of what the religion is.
Just like thinking about Saudi Arabia, which is an Islamist state, pro-U.S. though, being a democracy or claiming to be a democracy. And so
I
forth.
mean, I think Judith Butler's work has been very helpful for me on this in terms of her insistence that anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiment, and I would want to be more precise because anti-Semitism would include Arabs, that anti-Jewish sentiment exists, and it should be opposed without any question. And at the same time, to have any criticism of Israel captured as anti-Jewish is to me a huge problem. And I think she's been very helpful in disarticulating those things and providing ways that are anchored in Jewish intellectual tradition and theologies to make space for specifically Jewish traditions that are anti-Zionist.
Yeah. And there are a number of Jewish intellectuals and, ordinary Jews who are against the state of Israel because they say, I don't want you to do these atrocities in my name as a Jew. An interesting book, 2006, is Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Yeah, very good.
And he's an Israeli Jew. Who basically have been threatened so many times. He was a professor of history at Haifa University, and then he's now in the United Kingdom at Exeter University, also I think chair of Department of History. And in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, based on his research in Israeli archives, military and otherwise, and autobiographies of David Ben-Gurion, one of the founders of the State of Israel, and others. He shows how the Israeli state was established through the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, etc. So I think it is important for us to, before we go any further, to talk about Zionism as we have, and then how the State of Israel was created, etc. And also to say that, as you mentioned, any state based on religion would have a problem in terms of democracy and so forth. And for that, we can say, if you want to have democracy in Palestine, where the State of Israel was established in 1948, and in the rest of Palestine that Israel occupied, the State of Israel occupied in 1967, you have to, think about ways by which you get rid of Zionism while keeping the Jews who are there living side by side with the Palestinians and so forth. So these are some of the strains that you have mentioned in the beginning. You mentioned Edward Said also. Just for our viewers, who is Edward Said? Why you became interested in Edward Said?
Edward Said was a professor at Columbia, an American born in Jerusalem. I believe he was born in Jerusalem.
Yeah, 1935.
And his family was displaced during the Nakba in '48. He is the author of Orientalism and a very renowned academic, often attributed as one of the kind of first post-colonial scholars, although he had trouble with the term post-colonial, and a musician, a music critic, a literary critic, a very, very learned man, very opposed to any one camp or strain of thought. He, I think, was fond of saying criticism before solidarity was one of the things that he insisted on, but he also insisted on Palestinians permission to narrate, as he said. And in fact, some student groups have taken that up, permission to narrate, as part of their right to education movement, some students I met. And he was someone who was dubbed the Professor of Terror in, I think, 1988, maybe? It was in the late 80s. And was really, his office was firebombed. He received a lot of threats through his life for taking a position towards peace and justice, and had very close friendships with Jewish Israelis, and really was looking towards what you were talking about living side by side in peace. And his memoir really insists on his childhood being one of great cosmopolitanism, as he defines it, in terms of in a more Middle Eastern-based way, where it's usually European-based, but of people really mixing side by side without a lot of attention to who was what. And he really insists that this kind of division between Jews and Palestinians is of recent origin, and one that he, really felt was very was a huge problem, and not an equal problem, not an equal two sides, but a very imbalanced assault on Palestinian existence.
Yeah, even though to him was the so-called Jewish question, or so-called the Palestinian question, are two sides of the same coin, but they are not equal. There's a relationship of power there, as we've seen in the question of occupation, whether Palestinians who live inside the State of Israel since 1948, or those who have subsequently joined that kind of occupation by Israel in 1967. So, I just wanted to mention all these things ahead of that. And so you went to Palestine, occupied Palestine.
We were based in East Jerusalem.
Yeah. When did you do that?
In mid-May, and we were there for 11 days. I was part of a faculty development seminar. There were faculty members from various parts of the U.S. The program was designed to specifically promote alliances between African Americans working in historically Black colleges and universities, or with a large Black student body. And so that wasn't, so half our group was kind of situated in relation to African American studies and large populations of African American students. So that was an emphasis. And people were from various disciplines: geography, anthropology, English, peace and justice. So everyone had a different psychology. So everyone had a different disciplinary background. And we traveled for 11 days. We were based, as I said, in East Jerusalem, which is often not considered part of the West Bank, but is. And then we went from there to, we visited different universities and the different places that those universities were in. So we went to Ramallah and to Birzeit University. We went to An-Najah in Nablus. We went to Bethlehem University in Bethlehem. We went to Al-Quds in the Abu Dis district, and then Hebron University in Hebron.
Yeah, so there's a number of universities.
And we also visited some different cultural sites and some refugee camps, and met up with people who were heading up different organizations to promote different cultural forms of cultural life in the West Bank.
Yeah, and that was, as I understand, your first visit.
It was my first visit to Palestine.
Yes.
I did go to Israel when I was 15, as part of that, kind of rah thing. So this was a very different look.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was very struck there by how separate things are, because our guides and hosts were all Palestinian. We actually didn't have access to West Jerusalem. And in fact, it wasn't until the last day there, when we had a little bit of free time, that a friend and I, another person part of this program, we walked the 7 minutes or so into West Jerusalem. It was across the illegal tracks of the illegal light rail, and it was just a totally different world. Absolute erasure of any kind of, I mean, there are, of course, Palestinians living inside 48, and yet it just, everything there was, it really felt like I was in a very Jewish space, and a very different space also in terms of, it was very pristine, it was absolutely, you know, everything was very clean, and the streets were wide, and there were trees, and it was a big disparity from the West Bank, where, you know, one of the many problems is that there is no infrastructure for sanitation, and that Palestinians have to pay Israelis to collect their rubbish. And so that's just one of the many, many problems of occupation. And also that settlers, illegal Israeli settlers, dump their raw sewage into onto Palestinian land and sites. And so there was just a really big difference for me between those two things.
Yeah, and you have like a few pictures of the group that went with you, that you went with, actually, the group that you went with. And would you want to describe, like, for instance, this picture?
Well, actually, that is our guide, Mohammed Jadeh, who was in prison for 19 years. And he is from African Quarter of the Old City, which he showed us. He's holding a book there that was passed on to him by his father. And it was really quite amazing because his father has captured, you know, pictures of the old city, which he took us around, and he showed us, here's what this looked like at one point, here's what it looks like now. And he was very instrumental in a clinic or a center for community development. And he showed us that as well when we were in the old city. He said they arrived one day for work, and it had been shut down as a security risk. And the center was for women and children, and it was advertised for being of health of mind, body, and morals. And so he took us in there. It was trashed. He had just gotten the keys back. So we had really amazing guides our whole way through, and I was quite struck by just how much they knew. I mean, and also by just the range of pretty bad experiences all of them had had. He was, you know, one of the many people we met who had spent considerable amount of time in prison for resisting occupation. Pretty much everyone had stories of imprisonment for anything from setting up chairs for a rally or a anti-occupation gathering to going to stop the wall protests, to protesting at checkpoints, and people are also in prison for throwing rocks or for being accused of throwing rocks. And so that's another way to get yourself detained for a long time.
Yeah. So you visited the Jewish quarter of the old city?
Yes, we walked through there quite briefly.
Here again, Mahmoud Jadeh, actually, showing you other things in the city?
Well, that was in the African Palestinian Quarter where he lived, and he was showing us what it used to look like, and how they had expanded their housing in there. He had said his whole family was living in a really tiny, very hot room, and so he was showing us that.
Yeah, this slide about Area A, Area B, and Area C. So what you wanted to talk about that, maybe?
Well, one of the confusing things for me, and I'm still confused, so I think one thing I want to say about the West Bank and the system of checkpoints and permits and license plates is that on the one hand, it seems impossibly complex. I can't remember, there are like 98 different permits or more. I don't know, the number has probably changed between when I knew it and now. And so it seems very complex to try and figure out what's going on, but it's actually, at the same time, very, very simple. It's about making Palestinian life unendurable and getting Palestinians out of Palestine, and it's about occupation. And so on the one hand, people say, oh, it's so complicated. And the A, B, and C is complicated in that the West Bank is designated as, since the Oslo Accords, as under Palestinian control. And yet it is divided into different areas, A, B, and C. A is Palestinian control in name, if not in reality, because the Palestinian Authority was seen as pretty worthless by everyone we met. Area B is a kind of mix, a kind of hybrid, and is again about 20%. Then Area C is about 60%, and that's absolute Israeli control. And so really when people, say this is Palestinian land, it's under occupation. But it's also important to recognize that A and B are also under occupation. There's no sense of being outside of occupation when you're on the West Bank, because there are settlements everywhere, there are checkpoints everywhere. This sign that we're looking at here that says, this road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and against Israeli law. Again, it's saying, okay, you're entering A, so we say it's against the law. That makes no sense. It's also propaganda to make people think that Palestinians are dangerous terrorists. And in fact, some Jewish Israeli activists I was reading this week are going and papering those over with these white signs saying, the Israeli state is lying to you about this, and these places aren't dangerous, and you should come in. So this A, B, and C, it does make a difference in terms of the places that we visited. And there's also these designations like Hebron, which was the most horrific place that we went, is designated as H1 and H2. And H1 is under Palestinian control, and H2, I might be getting this reversed, is under Israeli control, and yet the whole thing is under Israeli control. But it does mean as you're walking down a street, when you shift from H1 to H2, that as you are walking down that street, there will be these yellow and white lines that appear. And when those lines are there, if you are Palestinian, you can't go outside those lines. And so if you're inside your yellow lines on one side of the street and your house is across the street, you can't cross the street if you're in, I think it's H2, it might be H1. And so you might have to walk 45 minutes to get.
Yeah, you have to go around.
Go around. Yeah. And then you can't go in through your front door because that would be dangerous to the Israeli settlers who have just taken over a house next door to yours. Yeah. So it was just really quite surreal to see what was going on in some of these spaces. So the A, B, and C is a way that the West Bank is divided up in name anyway, in terms of who controls what, but the whole thing is under occupation. Yeah,
and I might add that, this is as part of the Oslo Accords of 1993. They did these kinds of divisions. And interesting about Area A is that majority of the population is in Area A, but they have the least amount of land, percentage-wise, 18%. Area B, it is also administered by the Palestinian National Authority that was created as part of the Oslo Accords of 1993. But security is the realm of the Israeli forces. And Area C, where they have most of the land, is under Israel control, and not too many Palestinians live there. So it's an interesting thing how you can divide an occupied country and use it in a way that change the demographics, change the topology, change the geography of it, etc. For the benefit of the Israelis. So you mentioned something about the wall. You saw the wall, right?
Well, it's hard not to see the wall. The wall is pretty much everywhere you go. The wall, it's called the security wall by the Israelis. It's called many things by Palestinians, ranging from separation wall to apartheid wall. Most often I was hearing separation wall. And it is supposed to, it's theoretically to keep the green line secure, but most of it, it's twice as long as the green line. So it goes well into the West Bank. It's very serpentine, and it is often it will run right through people's land, Palestinian land. So somebody might have a house, and they might have an olive field, and then they can't access it because the wall goes literally right through it. And so, and for people then also need to get through checkpoints. So it can take hours to get someplace that should only take, no time at all. And so the wall is a very striking part of the West Bank. And when we were at Al-Quds University, the wall is literally right up against the university. It often is just right up against places. The other striking thing about the wall is that as it makes incursions into the West Bank, roads are built to accommodate that wall. And so even when that wall comes down, and I'm going to be optimistic and say when that wall comes down rather than if that wall comes down, it is still going to be determining routes of travel. And it's also the case that when we were traveling, we were in a bus with Israeli plates. And so we were on different roads than Palestinians often. Our roads were faster, they were better paved. We didn't have to wait at checkpoints in the same way. And so there are separate roads. And the other thing about the wall is that it's a very large, not only symbol, but literally concrete reminder of occupation, but so too are the system of checkpoints. There are several hundred internal checkpoints that are flying checkpoints, which means they can just pop up whenever and wherever. And our travel was limited by not knowing, is that checkpoint going to be open or not? So when we went to Nablus, for example, there is a checkpoint that often is closed. And so we drove an extra 45 minutes to avoid that checkpoint because we didn't want to get to the checkpoint, turn around, start over. So we just took the longer route. On the way back, our bus driver met up with somebody who called somebody, and they have systems of communication to find out about the checkpoints. And we were told, the checkpoint is open. So we went through the checkpoint, and there was a small girl lying in blood in the road, being attended to by Palestinians. There was a settler in a top hat and a long black coat out of his car. We drove up, he got in his car and, screeched off. And our bus at that point was rushed. And I'm sure because of our Israeli plates, and people were pounding on our doors, and we screeched off as well. I don't know what happened in that particular case, but I do know from reading weekly reports through Mānoaʻs and also the Applied Research Institute of Jerusalem that children are run down on the road, not infrequently. And that happens in Nablus, it happens at checkpoints, it happens in Aoude, it happens in Hebron a lot. And children are run down as well as arrested.
Palestinian children.
Palestinian children are run down by Jewish settlers.
Who have the right to carry arms.
They can do whatever they want, basically. I mean, one of the things that was, when we had our tour of Hebron, we were guarded by the temporary international presence in Hebron that monitors human rights abuses there. And what they were explaining to us was that because the Israeli army, they're not the police, so they don't have the right to arrest Israeli citizens, Israeli Jewish citizens. They do have the ability to arrest Palestinians. They're not supposed to arrest children who are under the age of 12, but they told us, and this has been corroborated by a number of reports that have been coming out recently, and there was one very high-profile case of a 5-year-old because it was captured on film, this 5-year-old being arrested for, I don't know if I think the 5-year-old did throw a stone.
Yeah, they said he threw a stone. Yeah.
One of the things that the guard told us is that the children, if the children are accused by another child of throwing a stone, or if they throw stones, and there is no need to say that they don't throw stones, because they do. And, you know, it's largely a symbolic act, frankly, but also could be, you know, occasionally could hurt somebody. The Israelis throw stones too, and worse, but the children do throw stones at each other, and we were told there are separate paths. So what we were told is that if an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli child goes and reports that a Palestinian child threw a stone, that child can just be taken away, detained. But the reverse cannot and does not happen because there's no policing authority, there's no police on the Palestinian side to be doing that. So you'd have to go as a Palestinian, report this to the Israeli army, and who might or might not do something about it. And from what I understand, it's might not, is what happens. And so, and this has, I think this latest news story that broke was really appalling, because what happened was this 5-year-old was caught on camera getting hauled off, screaming his head off. And there was accompanied by a flanking of Israeli soldiers who were totally calm. They were not violent with the child, except that taking a child off is violent. But they just calmly put this child in a vehicle, took him home, waited for the father to come home. They blindfolded the father, and then took the father and the child to the headquarters. And you can see their boss yelling at them because it's on film. And he points, and he's pointing at the cameras, and then he's back to them. So he's not saying, how could you arrest a 5-year-old child? He's saying, there are cameras. How could you do this in front of the cameras? And so this was very long-winded way into the wall. But the wall is but one manifestation of the kind of violence that happens through these different forms of monitoring and checkpoints and license plates and separate roads. And also architecturally, just one of the things that was explained to us by the director of the Applied Research Institute of Jerusalem is he was showing us maps, and he says, I always can predict where they're going to build a new road. And he says, they're going to build it, if it takes longer to connect settlements, they'll take longer if it cuts through a Palestinian village, because it will render that life uninhabitable. And so the West Bank is increasingly fragmented for Palestinians and increasingly joined together for Israeli settlers. And they're building tunnels and bridges, and they're creating a lot of stress on the land, actually, but also dividing up and fragmenting Palestinians. We've met people time after time who said they can't see their family members who are 10 minutes away because they can't travel the roads, they can't get through the checkpoints. People who are in Ramallah can't go into Jerusalem. People who are in Jerusalem can't go into Bethlehem. People who are in Bethlehem can't go into Jerusalem. So, you know, I met a Christian Palestinian man in Bethlehem, and he said, I can go into Jerusalem one day a year to worship. And he showed me he took out his paper and showed it to me. It was his one day a year.
And actually, in fact, last Christmas season, the Israeli authorities denied Christians from going to pray, you know, and celebrate Christmas and so forth. And then they would just like have a few people after like a long wait go in, and the rest wouldn't be able to do it. So this is like harassment already. But it's interesting, like when you say separate roads, separate this, separate that, I mean, what do you call that? You know?
I know what I call that. I call that apartheid.
Apartheid, yeah.
I call that apartheid.
And this is like racism, but not racism because they are only racist, but also because it makes sense for them to use these racist methods to ethnically cleanse the rest of the Palestinians from these areas.
I mean, I also would just want to say one thing about apartheid, because a lot of people get really worked up and they say this is not apartheid. Apartheid, because South Africa was like this, and this. South Africa does not define what apartheid is. It can look different in different places.
Absolutely.
And a number of South Africans have said, actually, it's worse.
Worse, yeah.
In Palestine, in occupied Palestine, than it was. And I'm not particularly interested in better or worse, but I think it's hard. I'd be hard put to call what I saw anything else.
Yeah, you cannot call it democratic, for instance. You know.
And if apartheid is about,
egalitarian,
separation that is enforced through institutions, enforced legally, enforced militarily, what I saw was a system of apartheid.
Yeah. Not only are they trying to create a Jewish state inside Palestine of 1948, but also to make the rest of Palestine Jewish. And the only way it can be done is by completely ethnically cleansing the rest of the Palestinians, regardless of whether they're Christian, Muslim, or what have you.
There was a lot of talk about, what's happening in that regard in the West Bank from people we met up with, and the way that's happening economically as well. And one of the things that, there were, we talked to a number of economists who were talking about just the different kinds of economic structures that are, in place. One is that it's very difficult to get jobs in the West Bank. Not as hard to get them if you're working for settlers. The wages are higher, but the rights, the workers' rights are pretty much non-existent. But they're also increasingly trying to get Palestinians hired as a way to combat the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So SodaStream, for example, which has been taking a pretty big hit on the international market because it is a West Bank company, has hired 400 Palestinian workers. So they can say, well, look, we're not operating under occupation. Of course, they still are. They still are an illegal company, illegally, working out of on occupied land. But anyway, there was so that's another. The economic structures are also doing this kind of work.
Yeah, the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. We will talk about it in a little bit.
Okay.
But what I wanted to continue with is the question of the way, the Israeli state utilizing settlers as well, and also their laws that they create to, steal land, more land from the Palestinians. They have a methodical way of doing this. In fact, I don't know, Eyal Weizman, who's an Israeli Jew as well, an architect and so forth, in his book Hollow Land, really he goes in detail in terms of how these policies are and the consequences of these policies and the impacts of those. Yeah.
Have you read his recent book, The Least of All Possible Evil?
No, not yet, but
it's amazing too. Yeah,
I read Hollow Land, and I read a couple of articles, that shows how the Israeli state does to steal more land and change the topography and even, build or do excavations underneath. That's why he talks about it as also Hollow Land.
In his recent book, he's looking also at humanitarian aid and how that corroborates with occupation and how people that were working militarily are now working in terms of aid. And he was talking about Gaza in particular and saying, it's okay if 29 people die. If 30 people die, you have a problem. And he said Israel monitors things so carefully, they know just when they're about to get past that point, and they'll put the electricity down until they're going to approximate that many deaths, and then they'll put it back up. And that they do that with calories as well. They kind of have a very carefully calibrated caloric count in terms of how many calories to let in to Gaza. So that book is really interesting too.
The other thing in terms of the caloric intake of Palestinians, not only is it calibrated, but even if it's calibrated that people won't die, yeah, but it has developmental effects, adverse developmental effects, especially on children. So you have like, deficiencies of micronutrients in the diet, of Palestinian diet, that has consequences for like development, brain development, and the rest of it, and including actually psychological and so forth. Yeah. So it's really horrific what they're doing, but it's interesting that the U.S. Keeps supporting the State of Israel in these kinds of policies. Yeah.
We over and over had people say to us, solidarity, not charity.
Yes.
And talk about the U.S. They said, oh, the U.S. gives all this money to knock things down, and then they give all this money to feed people and put them in refugee camps where they'll, and they kept saying, we do not want this kind of aid. This kind of aid does not help because we want self-sufficiency, we want solidarity. We don't want this kind of aid that actually normalizes and makes occupation just livable.
Yeah.
So that was something we heard a lot from people.
Did you want to say something about, like, if you want to call it architecture, like in terms of camps that are built there? Because I thought you wanted to talk about certain pictures.
Well, that slide that you're looking at there, which is from Al-Amari refugee camp, was pretty striking in terms of how we were, as we were getting a tour through there, being told, okay, first you had open space, then you had tents, then you had single buildings, and then in this photo, what you see are the buildings going out like that. And so what you have, first of all, is just a total claustrophobic experience of just this feeling of really significant enclosure. But you also have a really significant safety hazard because it's on that particular camp is on a fault line. And so when there's an earthquake, all of that's going to come down. And you also can see from that the electricity is pretty makeshift. And water is, I think Palestinians get, I'm probably going to underestimate this, but they get a fraction of the water that Israelis get. I think it's a 20th.
Yeah.
I think it's a 20th. And you can always tell when you're in a place that's mixed where the Israeli homes are and where the Palestinian homes are, because they have the water tanks, because water gets shut off a few days a week. And so the resources are also really radically insufficient.
Yeah. And actually, despite all of this, these kinds of policies and acts of, inhumane acts against Palestinians, yet the Palestinians have stood their ground as much as possible and tried to fight, against those kinds of things. So we're looking at this one. This slide. I don't know if you want to comment on it regarding right of return for the Palestinians.
Well, in addition to people showing us their keys and saying they were, and insisting on the right of return to homes, and by that they meant homes that have been, or homes that have been more recently demolished, because one of the things that, people were telling us about was that if you get a notice that your house is going to be demolished, then you have a certain number of days, and if you don't do it yourself, you have to pay for it to be done, and it's tens of thousands of dollars to demolish your own home. So right of return is that. But I think in terms of what you were saying about resistance, the thing that really, that we heard a lot about just because we were visiting music schools and cultural centers, was that people were really saying education was absolutely key. There was students were organizing under Right to Education. There's this R2E, Right to Education movement. And also through music.
We're looking at some slides.
We went to the Al-Amari Music School in Ramallah, which also has, they send out and teach kids in Gaza and in different camps. And they, the leader or the director of that, Ramzi Abu Redwan, has actually, there was just a story by Sandy Tolan in Electronic Intifada the other day, because he and his musicians were going to Jerusalem to perform Beethoven's Fifth. And they got stopped at the Calandia checkpoint, and 5 of the musicians were told they couldn't go through. So they climbed the wall. And so there's this photo of 5 of them scaling the wall. And they would have been, you know, they were risking imprisonment to play Beethoven's Fifth. And that music school, they do a lot of classical music, and both Palestinian classical music as well as Western classical music and hybrids of those. And they are doing really extraordinary work. One of the things I hadn't thought about was making instruments and infrastructure for a music school. And since people can't travel within the West Bank, so it's easier to get somebody from Belgium or Paris, or, you know, to get somebody from, or the US to come in than it is to get somebody from Gaza, for example, or, you know, Bethlehem. And so, but you can only stay 3 months if you're coming that way. And so one of the things that they're doing is they're sending kids to, like they had sent one of the kids to Belgium and to learn to make string instruments. Another kid was trained, I think, in Paris to learn to make pianos. And so they know that their students need to become teachers. And they have a very clear sense of this as a form of resistance and survival, as well as, you know, a form of pleasure and, you know, a way of making, because there was also this insistence on life, on working to make life normal and, you know, experience the same pleasures other people do.
As possible to stay, to remain normal.
Yeah.
It's interesting, like the question of resistance takes many forms. You saw like 5 Broken Cameras as an example, this movie, and shows like practically daily resistance for like Bil'in, the village of Bil'in, against the wall and so forth. So that's one form of resistance. But also in terms of talking about boycott, divestment, and sanctions as another form of resistance, but also trying to get people outside of Palestine to support them. So could you say a bit more about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions as way of resistance and also solidarity, not charity, with the Palestinians?
Sure. One of the things about the BDS, or boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, is it was started by Palestinians. It was a Palestinian call or campaign. It's a Palestinian-led campaign, because sometimes people say, oh, that's hurting Palestinians. And one of the things that really struck me during you know, our very short time there, but we did meet with a lot of people, we did not meet with a single person who did not ask us to support BDS. And more particularly, since I'm an academic and was traveling with other academics, the US ACB, which is the US Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. And that boycott is not aimed at individuals. It's aimed at not supporting institutions that develop and support occupation. So it does not target individuals, it targets institutions. What is being asked for is Palestinian right of return, also to put the West Bank back under Palestinian control. And there's one, I'm blanking out on the one other main claim, but it's to let prisoners go. It's basically to kind of address the wrongs of occupation, but also to insist on equal rights. That's the third thing that I was forgetting. Equal rights for Palestinians living inside of Israel. So it's not just Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, but also those existing within
so
Israel.
This BDS movement encompasses all of Palestinian living on all geographic Palestine.
And within inside the 48.
Yeah, that's why I said all of geographic Palestine.
So,
right. And then we should point out also that a number of Israeli academics support this boycott, divestment, and sanctions against, like even Israeli academic institutions, etc. But that wouldn't mean like you would be boycotting Ilan Pappé, who is an Israeli Jew and professor, because he also supports that BDS, right?
I think Gideon
Levy
just came out in support, said the best thing you can do for Israel's survival is to boycott, because otherwise these human rights abuses are so out of control that it's just, I think he was very dramatic in his language, and he's been a very on the left of things Israeli who has resisted boycott until quite recently. So you do see Israeli Jewish people calling for boycott, as well as Palestinians inside of Israel calling for boycott. And so, and then there are some that,
of course,
I mean, you get a lot of different positions on that, but it exists within, the Green Line as well, people calling for boycott.
Also, a significant figure is Miko Peled, who wrote the book The General's Son, and he was in the Israeli elite units, one of the elite units. And he was a Zionist par excellence, and he moved from that to going for a one-state solution rather than these kinds of solutions that area A, B, C, or what have you, or two states or whatever.
There's also been a kind of, I'm just forgetting what I was going to say about, forget it, it's gone out of my head.
That's fine. But, I just wanted to say, someone like Miko Peled, who was a Zionist, became anti-Zionist, and at the same time supports now the BDS movement, because he sees, as you said, if the state of Israel or the Jews in Israel now, if they want to continue living there, they have to be part of the larger Middle East, the Arab environment in which they exist. And they cannot just remain behind certain walls, whether the walls are physical or psychological, because that would be actually the demise of Israel as a, if it ever can be a democracy, the only way for it to become a democracy is to be one state where Jews, Christians, Muslims can live together in peace, and so forth. So I think that is an important thing to mention here.
Breaking the silence was what I was trying to think of, which is the people speaking out about what they did as soldiers, since everyone is required to serve in the military who was an Israeli citizen.
He's one of those, and there's a number of other people who were in the army, and they've been courageous enough to come out and see and talk about that. We have a photo here about something about BDS too, and so you want to say something about that regarding this particular group?
Well, that is the group I traveled with, although in the back of that picture is Majid Shihadeh, who is a Burzate faculty member in political science, who is one of the founding members of the U.S. Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. So
and he's from 1948. So.
Yeah, he is. And so he talked to us about BDS, and is also sitting next to a student who was one of the students active in Right to Education, which also supports BDS. And so, as I said, people, but it wasn't just people who are organizing who were supporting BDS. It was just really, I met a lot of English professors because I'm an English professor. So we'd have these breakout sessions with faculty members. And I have these guys, and they're working on Wordsworth and, Fitzgerald, and kind of a conservative Western curriculum. And they'd be talking, and then they would just start talking about occupation, and they'd say, please, support the boycott. It's the only way this is going to get solved peacefully. And so really, I was actually surprised by how, because there's so much controversy around boycott, at least in the U.S., and it's becoming less and less, but there's a lot of bad press around it. And so I was surprised by how unequivocally people asked us to support it when we were there.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's picking up steam, actually, in the U.S. and in Europe, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So there's hope in that. The other thing from one might surmise from what we're talking about is that the struggle of Palestinians for human rights, national rights, and to be treated equally and against occupation has been nonviolent civil disobedience kind of activities. I mean, BDS definitely. Of course, the demonstrations and rallies against the wall and so forth are also that. Yeah. So I think I want to mention that it is like, and it's not like terrorists, trying to terrorize the Israeli settlers. It's the opposite, that the Israeli settlers have been terrorizing the Palestinians and helping take over and steal their lands and ethnically cleansing the people, Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank.
I think just the one thing I would want to add to that is that I agree with the things that you're saying, and at the same time, it seems like sometimes people will seize on, well, he really did throw a rock, or what about the rockets? What about, suicide bombers? And, I was not surprised once I was in Hebron to realize that most suicide bombers are based, come out of Hebron, which was the most unbearable place that we visited. And that when you are under that kind of violent occupation, it is actually your legal right to resist it in any way that you can. Yeah. And so, yes, it is a largely peaceful form of resistance. But I also just think it's important to kind of say that what's going on there is, as you said, there's a whole people being terrorized, displaced, cleansed. And so however the resistance happens, that is a human right to resist that.
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations is clear about that, and international law is clear about that. Yeah,
exactly.
So you can resist in any which way is, effective.
To try and keep yourself safe.
Sure. So anything else you want to tell us about, your trip, and what did you come up with in terms of ideas and so forth to really support? After all, you went there to support and to learn, first of all, and then support. In terms of what would you be doing in terms of support for the Palestinians? I mean, of course, this program is one, and you've done another program and maybe other things like, shall we say, colloquia, what have you?
Well, I have joined the organizing collective of the U.S. ACB recently, so I'm doing that, and then also working with you on some biography. But I think that, I do think that one of the things that we were really asked to do by people there was to say what's happening. And we met the first woman mayor of Bethelem, and she swept into the room to meet us, and we had about a 45-second soundbite from her. She came in and she said, "Oh, you're all academics here. You study texts. Pay attention to your contexts. We are under occupation. Go home and, do something about that." And and then she swept out. It's like it was a quite impressive few seconds with her. And so I do think that, there's so much, the information, the narrative about that region is so tightly controlled that one thing to do is to try and, widen that, or to challenge that narrative.
Great. So we're flat out of time, I think. Thank you very much, Cindy, for coming over and sharing these great ideas and reflections. And thank you to our viewers, and see you next time. Aloha.